Poor Jude. All he wanted to do was wax eloquent about our common salvation, but he got sucked into this battle with false teachers who said that now that we're saved, there's no such thing as sin and I can do whatever I want. Well, Jude takes one look at these guys. He rolls up his sleeves. He points his finger and he says, "You're just like every sinner God has ever judged, and every sinner God will ever judge, and you will not escape judgment." Somehow, Jude contains all of his passion long enough to craft this beautifully structured woe oracle, which has 3 examples of rebellion and judgment, and then 3 more examples of rebels who corrupt others, and then an ancient warning and a recent warning. But Jude's letter is even more intricately structured than that. Take a look at this. Here is our structure. Here at the top, an opening charge, a closing charge, and then these pairs of examples and pairs of warnings. But some people have detected what they believe to be a chiasm within the book of Jude. And I think the most compelling argument for the chiasm is this pair of beloved, and then a reminder, and then a reminder, and then the word beloved again. That's interesting, but I still like our structure better. And what gives even more strength to this structure is another literary device called the midrash. This is a Jewish commentary form of writing, and it's pretty simple. In this form, these Jewish authors will quote the text, and then they will give their commentary on that text, their interpretation and application of that text. And it seems almost certain that this is what Jude is doing in his letter, because the text, the source text portions of the letter of Jude, as we divide it up 5 to 7 and 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 to 13, the source text sections are all in past or future tense, but the midrash sections are all in present tense. They're verbs. That's interesting. And then also the midrash section, it begins with the phrase "these people," describing these people who've crept into the church, these false teachers. So let me show you this. It's really quite neat. It's a little bit small, but this is intentional. So here in blue are our initial 3 examples. So we got the source text, example 1, example 2, example 3, and then the midrash, "these people," and it describes these people. And then we're going to have another source text here in verse 9 talking about the archangel Michael. So Jude references that source, and then he says, "these people, my false teachers that I'm addressing." And then we're going to have another set of 3 examples: the way of Cain, Balaam's error, Korah's rebellion, and then "these people are like this." And then we transition to our warnings, the first one from Enoch, and here's that warning in 14 and 15, and then the midrash, "these people," see in purple, "these are grumblers, malcontents." One final source text, this time it's a prediction from the apostles, that's in verse 18, and then 19 starts our midrash, "these who cause divisions, they're worldly people." Now, I just love how neat and tidy and orderly Jude is. He's my kind of guy. Well, why don't we jump into the text then and look at our initial section here in 5 to 10. Examples from the past of rebellion and God's judgment on that rebellion. Now, the point of this section is pretty simple. If God judged then, so he will judge now, and these guys won't escape judgment. Let's take a look at our 3 examples in this opening section, verses 5 to 10. So, those who died in the wilderness, that Exodus generation who perished over 40 years in the wilderness, they thought that they were part of God's people, right? But they did not enter the promised land because they did not believe. Now, the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah, their sin was homosexual sexual immorality. They desire to, they demanded to have sex with Lot's guests. It's pretty awful. But what about the sin of the angels? Now, this one is a bit tricky, and with this example, we are beckoned to enter into the weirdness of the book of Jude. Let's take a look at that in verse 6 of Jude. I'll make it bigger for you. Okay. So here's our first example, the wilderness. Second example, angels who did not stay in their own positions of authority, but left their proper dwelling. Okay, that's our sin, right? That's our sin. And then second half of this verse is our judgment. They're kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day. Sin, judgment. But you kind of notice that this verse 6 doesn't really tell you what the angels did, you know? It just says that they left their dwelling. It doesn't say what they did. But I think that verse 7 does tell us what the angels did, what their sin was. Look at verse 7. So we have the angels did something, and then verse 7, just as Sodom and Gomorrah, who likewise indulged in sexual immorality and unnatural desire. Now these phrases, just as and likewise, doesn't that imply that the sin of the angels is just as, it's likewise, it is the same as the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah, which is some form of sexual immorality? Well, that was the common traditional Jewish interpretation of Genesis chapter 6. Where it says that the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took them to be their wives. And the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, the mighty men of old. Now, the traditional understanding, the Jewish understanding, was that sons of God referred to angels who, bad angels, fallen angels, who assumed human bodies and then had impregnated and had children with the daughters of man. Now, to be honest, you guys, I have resisted this temptation, or this resisted this interpretation of Genesis 6 for a long time. It just felt so weird to me. But those phrases, likewise and in the same manner, just as the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah, it seems indisputable to me. And Jude, what he's doing then when he appeals to this common traditional understanding of Genesis chapter 6, he knows that this account will be understood and will communicate well to his Jewish audience, who is reading books like the Book of First Enoch, which is a pseudepigraphal work of Jewish literature that was written in the 2nd or 3rd century BC. And look what Enoch says, its interpretation of Genesis 6. I had to track down the Book of Enoch because it's not in my Bible. Here's the Book of Enoch, and I want to go down to chapter 6. And look how similar this is to our Genesis account. And it happened that when the sons of men multiplied in those days, they begat good and beautiful daughters, and the angels, he just straight up calls them angels, the sons of heaven, not sons of God, saw them and longed for them and said, hey, let's go have children with them. That'd be great, these evil angels. And they took the women for themselves, and they defiled them, and they became pregnant, and they brought forth giants. Maybe that's who these Nephilim and these mighty men of old are. At least that's the interpretation of the author of Enoch. Scroll down a little bit, look for some more yellow. And they went into the daughters of the people of the earth, slept with them, and defiled them, and they begat giants. And the earth was filled with blood and wrongdoing in those days. Now, it's all pretty strange, isn't it? Believe it or not, we're not done with the Book of Enoch yet. But the takeaway for now, we're going to address some of the complications of why Jude would reference the Book of Enoch in his letter. But the point for now, our takeaway, is that these false teachers, they are guilty of sexual immorality. They defile the flesh. They pervert grace into sensuality. And likewise, they will be judged. Now, our claim for the next 3 examples is that these guys are examples of rebels who corrupt other people. Now, this is pretty readily apparent for someone like Balaam, who convinced the Israelites to commit idolatry and sexual immorality with Moabite women. And it makes perfect sense for Korah as well, who led a rebellion against Moses and Aaron and their leadership. and everyone who followed them, the earth opened up and swallowed them whole. So that kind of makes sense here. But again, what about Cain? What is Cain doing in this list? Well, again, Jude is a bit of a weirdo. And in the same way that these old intertestamental Jewish authors fixated on people like Enoch and Melchizedek, they also had a special interest on this character of Cain from Genesis 4. Let me show you what one commentator has said about this intertestamental literature regarding the person of Cain. Now we're going to look, we can put you away for now. We're going to look at this commentary. It is written by Peter Davids, and it is in the Pillar New Testament Commentary series. And he's writing some comments on that phrase, they have taken the way of Cain. Look what he says. Other ancient authors go beyond this to see Cain not only as guilty of a variety of sins, but as one who taught them to others. Look what Josephus says. He says that Cain excited his acquaintances to procure pleasures and spoils by robbery and became a great leader of people into wicked courses. I guess Philo said a similar thing. In other words, not only were a variety of sins, including lust, that's an important one, including lust, attributed to Cain, but he was presented as one who taught these sins to others, and therefore he was a perfect picture of these false teachers. Now, we don't know that Cain actually did any of these things, but in lumping him in with Balaam and Korah, what Jude is doing is he's relying on a commonly known tradition which pictured Cain as a corrupter of others. Now, the midrash section of 11 to 13, the midrash section, talking about these people, and its application to these false teachers, just like Balaam, who accepted money from King Barak in order to make the Israelites fall into temptation and sin with the Moabite women. So these false teachers are shepherds who feed themselves. They take money and sustenance from the church, getting money for their false teaching. And then also this teaching of theirs, it kind of seems appealing from the outside. It's like a rain cloud that can water our crops, or a tree that can feed us, or maybe a star that can guide us as we try to walk through the darkness. But their teaching lacks all substance. They're waterless clouds, fruitless trees, and it's a teaching that will lead to destruction, both for themselves, the destruction of these teachers, and the destruction of those who follow them as well. Remember that hidden reefs image with the ships crashing into it? Well, now that we're done looking at these examples, we're going to transition into the warnings. Jude is ready to issue a couple of warnings. In the first warning, here in 14 to 16, it looks like it'd come right out of the prophets, right out of the Old Testament prophets. Take a look. I'm going to jump back to Jude. Jude 1. This is in 14 and 15. This looks just like the prophets, doesn't it? The Lord will come with his angels, and he's going to execute judgment on all of the ungodly people. This is all over the prophets, right? It's the day of the Lord when he comes to destroy all of his enemies and establish his kingdom. But that quotation here, that warning, it doesn't come from the prophets. He introduces it by saying that it was about these that Enoch, seventh from Adam, prophesied, saying. Now, I don't remember Enoch saying anything in Genesis chapter 5 because he didn't. You see, Jude is at it again. This time, he's going to quote directly from the book of 1st Enoch. Let me show you. Now he's in Enoch chapter 1. So let's go over here, go to Enoch 1. Now compare this section here with verse 9 of Enoch chapter 1. Enoch's talking about the day of the Lord. And it says here in verse 9 that he will come with 10,000s of his holy ones to enact judgment against all, destroy everyone who is ungodly, and all the harsh things that they spoke, and all that the ungodly sinners spoke against him. Wow, that looks like a direct quotation to me. So what do we do with this? How do we explain and wrap our minds around the fact that Jude could quote from a book that is certainly not within the Old Testament canon? Well, just because Jude quotes one verse from a book and apparently agreed with what is said in that one verse does not mean that he agrees with everything in the Book of Enoch, or that he thinks that that book is inspired. It does not, that does not follow. I mean, Paul, he's going to quote from Greek poets in Acts 17, and he's going to quote from Cretan prophets in Titus chapter 1, but that doesn't mean that he thinks that they're inspired. Certainly not. And then also, neither Paul nor Jude is going to use the standard quotation formulas, which are used when scripture, God-breathed inspired scripture, is being quoted. So he doesn't say something like, this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken, which you'll read all over the book of Matthew, or something like, as it is written, which you'll see all over the epistles. That's not used when Enoch is quoted here. So why does Jude use it at all? Take a look at what another commentator has said. I think his explanation is helpful. This time, we are going to open up the Tyndale New Testament Commentary series. This is this particular book within this series is written by Michael Green, and he says that Jude does not necessarily endorse all of the truths within Enoch, but he does, however, I like this, like a shrewd preacher, use the current language and thought forms of his day in order to bring to home to his readers, his Jewish readers, in terms that are highly significant to them, the perils of lust and pride committed by these false teachers who are attempting to manipulate them. Now, the midrash section for both of these warnings, it is going to zero in on these false teachers' influence of others. These guys are ungodly scoffers who are grumblers, and they are causing division, trying to pull after themselves people within Jude's congregation who likewise will justify their sensuality by a perversion of the doctrine of grace. They are pulling people into their own destruction. Now, Jude gave a warning saying, these guys are coming and they will be judged. But there's a massive shift which is going to take place in verse 20. All right, let's look now at Jude's closing charge. A massive shift that takes place in verse 20. Because all the way since verse 4, it's just been this unrelenting, scathing attack against these false teachers who sin shamelessly. Look, they boast in their sin, and they want to pull others into the darkness with them and into the eternal fire. And Jude is going to shout, save them, snatch them from the fire, those who these teachers are attempting to manipulate. But again, the subject is going to change here in verse 20, where he says, but you, beloved. And let's look at that moment of transition there in verse 20. So all of this has been about these people, these false teachers. But then here in verse 20, but you, beloved, keep yourselves in the love of God. Now remember, way back in the opening, Jude is going to state his thesis, contend for the faith. But he never really says how to do that until, I think, down here in verse 20, where he says, contend for the faith by keeping yourselves in the love of God. Now, the false teachers, they have no love for God, do they? They have contempt for him and for his laws. But Jude's church loves God, and Jude's going to say, stay in that love. And then Jude, who loves the number 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, what's he going to do? He's going to give 3 ways that his church can do just that. 3 ways they can keep themselves in the love of God. They can do that by building themselves up in their most holy faith, probably referring to a studied focus on the teaching of the apostles and on the scriptures. They can keep themselves in the love of God by praying in the Spirit, waiting for the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. But that's a lot of work, isn't it? It's a lot of work to keep oneself in the love of God. Do you think you can do that on your own strength? Well, Jude doesn't, but he knows that you don't have to. You see, the same people that Jude charges, keep yourself in the love of God, he's going to address in the very beginning of his letter as those who are kept for Jesus. And then he closes his letter giving glory to the one who is able to keep you from stumbling and to present you blameless before the presence of his glory. To him, Jude says, to the one who will keep you, be glory, majesty, dominion, and authority before all time, now and forever. Amen.